Annika Stalczynski. In the autumn of 2020, in Newark, Delaware, a high school junior left her home one evening and never came back. Her name was Madison Sparrow, and within days the search for her would lead straight to two people she believed she could trust. Madison was lured into a wooded area behind McClary Elementary School, where two people had arranged to meet her. Her classmate Annika Stalczynski and Madison's former boyfriend, then 19, Noah M. Sharp. Madison did not walk back out. Her body was found in those woods days later. So what had drawn her there in the dark, and why would a classmate be part of it? When her body was recovered, an autopsy confirmed the cause of death, and investigators began retracing her final hours. The picture that emerged was not one of a chance encounter. The meeting had been arranged in advance. Detectives established that the two had coordinated to bring Madison to that isolated spot behind the school, where she would be alone and unprotected. In the hours after Madison failed to come home, her family raised the alarm, and what had started as a missing persons search quickly hardened into something far worse. The location itself told a story. A wooded patch behind a school was not somewhere a young woman wandered to alone late in the day. It was a place someone had to be led to, and that meant someone had to do the leading. Stalczynski was no stranger to the girl she helped lead into the trees. The two had been classmates at Newark Charter High School, moving through the same hallways and the same circles. According to Delaware State Prosecutor A.J. Roop, the pair had known one another going back over a number of years. That familiarity is exactly what made the case so chilling. This was not a predator in the shadows. It was a face Madison recognized. But here is the question that still has no answer. What was the reason? Delaware's Department of Justice has never publicly disclosed a motive. No feud, no explanation, nothing offered to the public to make sense of it. A young woman was led to her final moments by someone she knew, and the why has stayed sealed away ever since. The turning point came when prosecutors built their case around Stalczynski's own words. The conspiracy count was telling on its own, because it signaled that this had not been a sudden, impulsive act, but something agreed upon in advance between two people. In November of 2020, she was indicted on first-degree homicide, first-degree conspiracy, and a related felony count. For more than a year, the proceedings crept forward. Then, in May of 2022, Stalczynski pleaded guilty to first-degree homicide and first-degree conspiracy, and she agreed to do something that would decide her former co-defendant's fate. She agreed to take the stand against him. That moment arrived in October of 2022, at Sharp's trial. With her testimony part of the record, he was convicted on all counts and faced a mandatory life term. The classmate who once shared Madison's school halls had become the witness who helped seal the conviction of the other person who was in those woods that day. Did cooperation buy her freedom? It did not. In February of 2023, Stalczynski was sentenced to life imprisonment. Under Delaware's juvenile sentencing statute, she holds the right to ask for a review of that sentence only after she has served 30 years, which means no earlier than roughly the year 2053. And did she accept it quietly? She did not. Years later, she tried to undo the conviction altogether. In December of 2025, a Superior Court judge dismissed her motion for post-conviction relief, ruling it had been filed too late. She remains behind bars to this day. Yet the one answer that matters most to the family Madison left behind, the reason any of this ever happened, has never once been spoken aloud in a courtroom or anywhere else. This story played out among classmates, in the open air behind a school. The next would move inside a family home, where the person at its center shared a name with the man who had raised her. Mindy Berenyi. In the fall of 1995, in the small farming community of Antwerp, Ohio, a teenager waited inside her own home for her father to come back. When he finally walked through the door, he never made it past the kitchen. The young woman was Mindy Ann Berenier. The man was her father, William Berenier II, known to everyone simply as Andy. On the 27th of September, Mindy went into her father's bedroom, took his shotgun, and waited for him in the kitchen bathroom. When Andy arrived home, she fatally wounded him from behind. Who walks into a scene like that? Her stepmother, Joni, did. Joni found Mindy still holding the firearm, managed to talk her down, and Mindy initially confessed to what she had done. To understand how a teenager reaches that point, investigators and, later, a jury had to look hard at the household behind the front door. Mindy was a high school student. Her parents, Shirley and Andy, had divorced, and Shirley had left the children in Andy's care, an arrangement that placed Mindy under the roof of the very man whose conduct would later be put on trial. In the months leading up to that September night, Mindy had been struggling badly. She had been diagnosed as deeply depressed and had spent 9 days in a hospital not long before the shooting. She had already shown signs that something was deeply wrong well before that evening in the kitchen. But the case refused to stay simple. What began as a confession unfolded into one of the most divided family stories Ohio had followed in years. Why? Because the people closest to it could not agree on what was true. Mindy's defense argued that she had endured serious mistreatment at her father's hands and had finally reached a breaking point. Her mother backed those claims. Her brothers, Steve and Scott, contradicted them directly on the stand. The same household, the same father, and two completely opposite accounts. So who was telling the truth? And who was protecting a memory? The legal road was just as tangled as the family one. In December of 1996, Mindy first pleaded no contest to a reduced charge and was given 15 years to life. But that plea was later thrown out, and the entire matter went to trial in 1999. Her lawyers built their defense around the idea of a battered child acting in self-defense, leaning on a recognized Ohio legal precedent that allowed such testimony to be heard by a jury. It was a bold approach, asking the court to see the household, and not just the night itself, as the real story. Did the strategy work? Not the way her side had hoped. On the 11th of June, 1999, a jury convicted her of aggravated homicide. She was sentenced to 20 years to life, with an additional 2 years attached because a firearm had been used. The conviction was upheld on appeal, closing off the path her defense had hoped would set her free. So where is Mindy Berenier now, decades after that night in Antwerp? Ohio corrections records have listed her as incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, serving out her 20 years to life term. Hers remains a case that has never fully settled in the public mind, and the reason is simple. The people who knew the family best could never agree on the truth of what happened inside that home. Was she a frightened young person who believed she had no other way out? Or was she someone who made a calculated choice and lay in wait? A jury answered one version of that question. Her own family has spent the years since answering another, and they have never landed on the same page. What stays with anyone who studies the case is the silence at the center of it. A father gone, a daughter convicted, 2 brothers on one side, a mother on the other, and a confession that started everything before the story splintered into pieces that never fit back together. This case turned on what happened behind one family's closed doors. The next would unfold in the open, on a busy city street, far from anyone the people involved had ever known. 3 teenage girls in London. On a winter night in 2025, on a busy road in Islington, North London, an evening out turned into a tragedy that would shake an entire community. A retired man, simply walking near a bus stop, crossed paths with 3 young strangers who decided to turn on him. His name was Freddie Rivero, 75 years old, a Bolivian national who had built a quiet, dignified life in the city. On the 27th of February, 3 teenage girls got off a bus on Seven Sisters Road and surrounded him. What followed lasted only minutes. They set upon him, one of them recorded it on a phone, and his glasses were snatched away. Mr. Rivera was left on the pavement. Why him? Why a man none of them had ever met? He was found unconscious with a serious head injury and went into cardiac arrest. He was taken to the Royal London Hospital, and the following day, the 28th of February, he lost his life. The confrontation had been entirely unprovoked. There was no argument, no history, no reason at all. He was simply there. To understand the weight of what was lost, you have to know who Freddie Rivera was. He had worked at the Mayfair Hotel Dukes for more than 25 years before retiring. And he was a painter, a calligrapher, a chess player, and an amateur astronomer with a daughter who adored him. A gentleman with a curious mind, undone in moments by strangers on a public street. How does a case like this even begin to be solved? In a sense, the hardest part was already captured. The recording, the witnesses on a public road, and the rapid police response narrowed the investigation quickly. There was little mystery about what had occurred. Only the work of identifying everyone involved and deciding how the law should answer it. The three were arrested on suspicion of grievous bodily harm and then charged with manslaughter on the 1st of March. In a matter of days, an evening that should have been ordinary had become a formal homicide case moving through the courts. What happened when the case reached court? Here the story took a turn that surprised many who had followed it. All three pleaded guilty to manslaughter at the Old Bailey on the 12th of June before Judge Judy Kahn, KC. There would be no drawn-out trial, no fight over who did what. They admitted their part, and the focus shifted entirely to the question of what their punishment should be. Then came the sentencing, and with it a debate that has not gone quiet since. On the 3rd of October, the three were sentenced at the Old Bailey to a combined total of 9 years in detention, with the individual terms ranging from 2.5 years to 4 years. Was that enough for the loss of a man so loved? For Mr. Rivera's family, and for many who read about the case, the numbers felt impossibly small against what had been taken. There is one detail that shapes how this story can ever be told. Under long-standing British law protecting young defendants, the three cannot be publicly identified. Their names will not appear in headlines. They will serve their terms in youth detention and, in time, walk free with their identities shielded. For a public that had seen part of what happened, the idea that those responsible would remain anonymous only deepened the sense of unease. So what remains? A community that lost a gentle retiree it had grown to recognize on its streets, a daughter without her father, and a hard, uncomfortable set of questions about how a brief, senseless encounter between strangers could end a life of more than 7 decades in the space of a single evening. The girls came from northeast London, and the confrontation was filmed and shared, which is part of what made the case land so heavily in the public eye. People did not just read about it. In a sense, they watched a fragment of it. And that fragment, more than any court document, is what turned a local tragedy into a story that traveled far beyond Islington. That confrontation lasted only minutes, between people who had never met. The next was planned over time, inside a household where everyone knew one another well. Sierra Halseth. In the spring of 2021, in a quiet neighborhood of northwest Las Vegas, a successful father opened his home to his teenage daughter and her boyfriend. Within days, he would be gone, and the people responsible would be filming themselves laughing. The young woman was Sierra Halseth. The man was her own father, Daniel Halseth, 45 years old. Over 2 days in April, Sierra and her boyfriend, then 18, Aaron Guerrero, ended Daniel's life inside his home. An autopsy later documented numerous injuries, and his body was concealed in the garage where a fire was set. How could a daughter turn on the man who raised her? And what did the pair do next? What they did next is part of what made this case so disturbing. The couple fled in Daniel's car, using his debit card as they went, and were arrested in Salt Lake City within days. Investigators later recovered video of the two of them laughing together in the aftermath, treating what they had done almost like content for an audience. That recording, more than any single piece of testimony, shaped how the public would come to see them. Two young people who seemed strikingly untroubled by what had just taken place. To understand the family at the heart of this, you have to know that Sierra came from a household with a public profile. She was the daughter of a former Nevada state senator and Daniel Halseth, who had divorced years earlier, with her mother holding primary custody. Sierra and Guerrero had begun dating in the summer of 2020, when both sets of parents tried to keep them apart after the teens discussed running away together to Los Angeles. The relationship only intensified. What was meant to cool things down seemed to push them closer, and towards something no one saw coming. So what did Sierra say when it was her turn to speak? At sentencing, she claimed her father had harmed and mistreated her, allegations that his family strongly denied. The Halseth family pushed back firmly against the portrait she painted, leaving the public with two irreconcilable versions of the same man. The turning point in the courtroom came when both defendants chose to admit guilt. In May of 2022, Sierra and Guerrero each pleaded guilty to 9 counts, including the homicide, first-degree arson, robbery, and conspiracy. As part of the arrangement, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the harshest possible penalty against Guerrero, who had been an adult at the time. What sentence did they ultimately receive? In October of 2022, a district judge sentenced each of them to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 22 years, along with $5,000 in restitution. It meant that neither would be eligible for release until roughly the year 2044. For two people who had been so determined to share a future together, the result was a long stretch of years measured out in separate cells. And where are they now? Sierra Halseth is held at the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center, while Guerrero is incarcerated separately at a men's facility. Two young people who had been told only that they could not be together are now serving long terms apart, behind separate sets of walls. What lingers about this case is the gap between the ordinary and the unthinkable. A father, a divorced family, a teenage romance that parents tried to slow down. Those are common enough threads. Yet they led to a garage fire, a stolen car, a cross-state flight, and a recovered video of two young people laughing in the days that followed. Was Sierra a young woman pushed past some private breaking point, as she insisted? Or was she, as the prosecution framed it, a willing partner in a plan that she helped carry out from start to finish? The court reached its conclusion. Daniel Halseth's family has been left to carry the rest, including the public airing of claims about a man no longer able to answer them. This case was recent, set against the bright lights of a desert city. The next reaches back decades to a young woman whose record once promised a very different life. Elizabeth Haysom. In the spring of 1985, in the rolling countryside of Bedford County, Virginia, a respected retired couple were found in their home, the victims of a crime that would take years to fully untangle. The trail would eventually lead to their own daughter, a gifted university student who had built herself a careful alibi miles away. The couple were Derek Haysom, a retired steel executive who had once led a major Canadian firm, and his wife, Nancy. On the night of the 30th of March, both lost their lives inside their home, and their bodies were not discovered until the 3rd of April. Who could have done this to two retirees in a peaceful corner of Virginia? And where was their daughter while it happened? That daughter was Elizabeth Haysom, then a 20-year-old student at the University of Virginia. The person responsible was her boyfriend, Jens Soering, an 18-year-old honor student and the son of a West German diplomat. Elizabeth had set up an alibi by renting a car and driving with Soering to Washington, D.C., creating distance from the scene at the very hours it mattered most. How does an investigation crack a case this carefully arranged? The answer came partly from Soring himself. He later confessed, then took it back and pointed the finger at Elizabeth instead. The two had fled to England, and it was there that authorities caught up with them, arresting the pair in 1986. From that point on, the case became a contest over who had truly driven events. The student who built the alibi, or the young man who first admitted what had happened. Who was Elizabeth Haysom, really? On paper, she had every advantage. Born in southern Rhodesia and educated at an English boarding school, she had earned a prestigious scholarship to the University of Virginia, where she met Soring. She was the kind of student whose future seemed assured. As part of the saga, she alleged that she had been harmed by her mother, a deeply contested claim that became woven into both her defense and later coverage of the case. The turning point came when Elizabeth made her own choice in court. In 1987, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of being an accessory before the fact and was sentenced to 90 years, 45 years on each count, to be served one after the other. Soring, by contrast, fought the charges. He was convicted at his trial in 1990 and received 2 consecutive life sentences. Did 90 years mean 90 years? It did not. She first became eligible for parole in 1995 and applied again and again over the years that followed. Decades into her term, the case took its final dramatic turn. In late 2019, the governor of Virginia announced that both Haysom and Soring would be paroled, though not pardoned. Elizabeth was released after 32 years and, in early 2020, was deported by immigration authorities to Canada. So where is she now, and how does the world see her after all this time? Following renewed attention tied to a Netflix series about the case, she has remained in Canada and stays out of the public eye, reportedly at the request of her relatives. The brilliant student who once seemed destined for an enviable life now lives quietly, far from the country where her name became infamous. For someone who built a career-track future at one of the country's most respected universities, it is a striking place to have ended up anonymous by choice, defined forever by a single spring night in the Virginia countryside. What makes this case endure is the puzzle at its heart. Was Elizabeth the mastermind who arranged everything and let someone else do the worst of it? Or a young woman caught in a relationship that spiraled beyond her control? Soring spent years insisting on his own account, and she on hers. The courts assigned the legal weight long ago. The deeper truth has stayed contested for the better part of 4 decades. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. This story centered on a privileged student who seemed to have every advantage. The next would involve someone who had almost none, and a quiet retiree who simply opened her door. Ruth Ann Veal. In the summer of 1993, in Waterloo, Iowa, a retired university librarian came home to a house that should have been empty. Inside, a young runaway was waiting. And the quiet life Catherine Haynes had built would end that night. Catherine Haynes was 66 years old, a retired librarian from the University of Northern Iowa, the kind of woman whose name rarely appeared in the news. The young person hiding in her home was Ruth Ann Veal, a runaway from a group home in another part of the state. And that night, Catherine was fatally injured. How does a stranger end up inside a retiree's home? And what happened after? What happened after told investigators a great deal about the person they were looking for. Veal took Catherine's car and credit cards and went on a spending spree across Cedar Rapids and Iowa City before being arrested days later. The trail of purchases was its own kind of evidence, leading police straight back to the runaway who had used a dead woman's accounts as if nothing had happened. The decision that shaped everything came early. Veal was charged as an adult, and at the time of her conviction in 1994, Iowa officials described her as the youngest girl then held in the state's adult corrections population. That single choice, to try her as an adult, would echo through the courts for the next 3 decades. A teenager who had drifted out of a group home was now facing the full weight of the adult system, and the questions about whether that was just would follow her case for years. Did her conviction hold up? It did, again and again. Her direct appeal was denied, and a federal court later turned away her request for relief as well. She had been given a mandatory term of life, with no chance of parole, the harshest sentence available, and for years it looked permanent. Then the law itself began to shift beneath her. A landmark ruling reshaped how courts could sentence young offenders, and Veal's case became one of the places where that change played out. The governor first commuted her sentence in 2012, but the Iowa Supreme Court held that the result still amounted to punishment that was too harsh for someone who had offended so young. On the 9th of December, 2013, a district judge formally resentenced her to life, with the possibility of parole. That single word, possibility, changed her future. Slowly, the doors began to open. In late 2020, Veal was granted work release, and the following June, she was granted full parole. After more than a quarter of a century behind bars, the youngest girl once held in Iowa's adult population was, at last, free. But here is the question that the next chapter forces. Was she ready for that freedom? In December of 2022, the answer turned out to be complicated. Her parole was revoked after she was found to have visited bars and a casino, and to have been in contact with others convicted of serious crimes. An administrative law judge concluded that if she would not follow the rules of supervision, then the alternative is a return to prison. And so she went back. As of the most recent reporting, Veal had been returned to the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women, the same kind of facility that had held her since she was a teenager. Decades of legal battles, a sentence struck down, a hard-won release, and then a quiet slide back behind the walls. What stays with anyone who follows this case is the sheer length of it. A retired librarian who simply wanted to go home, a runaway with almost nothing to her name, and a legal saga that outlasted nearly everyone who first reported on it. Veal grew from a teenager into a middle-aged woman in custody, was handed a second chance, and could not hold on to it. Few cases capture so plainly how the questions raised by a single night can stretch across an entire lifetime, with the answers shifting every time the law itself changed. This case followed one young drifter across decades of courtrooms. The next crossed the ocean to England, where a missing young person would expose 2 people who had been hiding in plain sight. Shauna Hoare. In the early months of 2015, in Bristol, England, a young student vanished from her family home. Within days, the search would expose 2 people the family thought they knew, and one of them was closer than anyone wanted to believe. The missing student was Becky Watts. The 2 responsible were her stepbrother, Nathan Matthews, and his partner, Shauna Hoare. For a short, agonizing window, Becky's loved ones searched and hoped. Then the truth arrived, and it was devastating. Becky had lost her life, and the people connected to it were not strangers at all. How do you investigate a disappearance when the answer is hiding inside the family? That was the grim shape of this case from the start. Police moved quickly once suspicion turned toward Matthews and Hoare. Becky was eventually found at a property in another part of Bristol, and investigators began assembling the timeline that would later be laid out in court. The forensic and digital trail tied the pair to what had happened and to the steps they had taken afterward to cover their tracks. Messages, movements, and physical evidence were pieced together until the sequence of events became clear. What had begun as a missing person appeal hardened into a full homicide investigation, with 2 suspects who had been part of Becky's own world. Who was Shauna Hoare in all of this? That became one of the central questions of the trial. She had been in a relationship with Matthews for some time, and prosecutors argued she was no bystander, but a knowing participant in the plan that led to Becky's death. Her defense painted a different picture, one in which Matthews was the driving force. So how much had she truly known, and how much had she chosen to do? The turning point came in the autumn of 2015, when the case reached Bristol Crown Court. The trial drew national attention, and the jury was left to untangle exactly what each defendant had done. After deliberating, the jury found Matthews responsible for her death and found Hoare guilty of the lesser count of manslaughter. Both were also convicted of conspiracy to kidnap and of further related offenses tied to what happened afterward. What did the sentences look like? In November of 2015, Matthews was handed a life term with a minimum of 33 years, while Hoare received 17 years. The gap between the two reflected the jury's reading of their roles. But for Becky's family, no number could begin to measure what had been taken. Did either of them succeed in challenging the outcome? They did not. The following year, the Court of Appeal rejected both of their applications to challenge their convictions or sentences, finding no reasonable argument that anything had gone wrong. The verdict stood, and the case appeared to be settled. But sentences in years are not always served in full, and that is where this story took its most painful turn for the people left behind. In early September of 2023, Shauna Hoare was released from prison after serving half of her 17-year term. Conditions of her release reportedly included staying away from Bristol, with the finer details withheld by authorities. How did Becky's family respond? Her mother spoke openly of her anger at the release, a reaction that captured what so many families in these cases describe. The person at the center of their worst loss was walking free, while their own grief carried no end date. Matthews, by contrast, remains imprisoned with many years still ahead of him on his minimum term, which keeps him behind bars well into the future. The contrast between the two outcomes became, for the family, one more thing to carry. What lingers about this case is the betrayal woven through it. A young person who should have been safe within her own family circle. Two people who were part of that circle, and a release that reopened a wound the family had been told would at least be partly answered by time. This story unfolded in an English city. The next returned to America, where a young woman and an older partner turned on someone he had known his entire life. Caitlin Coons. In the spring of 2023, in Sylvania Township, Ohio, a mother was fatally injured in her own kitchen. The young woman responsible had been hiding in the house all along, unknown to the victim, and she had given an ultimatum that her boyfriend could not bring himself to carry out. The mother was Nicole Jones, 53 years old. The young woman was Caitlin Coons, and her boyfriend was Nicole's own son, 33-year-old Jonathan Jones. Coons had been hiding in Jonathan's bedroom without his mother's knowledge, and when she decided Nicole was standing in the way of their relationship, she fatally injured her in the kitchen. How does a mother end up in danger inside her own home from someone she did not even know was there? The detail that stunned investigators was the ultimatum. Coons reportedly gave Jonathan a few hours to act against his mother for what she saw as interference, and when he failed to do it, she carried it out herself. It reversed every assumption about who was driving the relationship. What happened to Nicole afterward made the case even harder. Her body was wrapped in a tarp and placed in an apartment complex dumpster, which was hauled away the next day, and she has never been found. The couple then fled the country. They were tracked to northern Mexico and arrested in May of 2023 by the U.S. Marshals Service. Who was Caitlin Coons, and how did this relationship form? The background is troubling. Coons was a runaway who had been in foster care, while Jonathan already carried a prior record and had been in an unlawful relationship with a much younger Coons, wearing a court-ordered monitor at the time. Her defense later argued that she was a young person who had been manipulated and controlled by an older man, a dynamic they described as a damaging emotional bond. They portrayed her not as a mastermind, but as someone shaped and steered by a relationship she should never have been drawn into. Prosecutors saw it very differently, pointing to who had given the order and who had acted on it. So who really held the power between them? That question sat at the heart of the case. Coons gave the order. Jonathan did not act, and then the younger of the two did the thing the older one would not. The turning point came when both stopped fighting the charges. Coons was charged as an adult, and in June of 2024, she and Jonathan each pleaded no contest to aggravated homicide, an account tied to the concealment of the body. There would be no trial to relive the details in open court. What sentence did they receive? A Lucas County judge sentenced each of them to life with parole eligibility after 25 years, which means neither will be considered for release before roughly the year 2049. For a woman whose body was never recovered, it was the closest thing to an answer her family would get. Was the criminal case the end of it? Not quite. A wrongful death suit was also filed on behalf of Nicole's estate, seeking damages from the two people who had taken her from them. It was a separate fight in a different court, but part of the same long effort to hold someone accountable for a woman whose remains were never recovered. What stays with anyone who studies this case is the inversion at its core. A son who could not raise a hand against his mother, and a young partner who decided she would. A woman gone, a body that was carried off and never found, and a relationship that turned an entire family inside out in the space of a single evening. For Nicole's loved ones, the absence of any place to lay her to rest became its own lasting wound, layered on top of everything else they had lost. This case ended with a search that crossed a border. The next stayed close to home, inside a single house, where an everyday frustration spiraled into something no one could undo. Megan Joyce Emirowicz. In the autumn of 2021, in Groveland Township, Michigan, a father fell asleep on his couch and woke to a moment that would slowly cost him his life. The person responsible was his own daughter, and the trigger was almost unbelievably small. The father was Conrad Emirowicz, 64 years old. The daughter was Megan Joyce Emirowicz. On the 1st of October, Megan poured a caustic household chemical mixed with water onto her sleeping father. The harm was severe and lasting. Conrad suffered extensive chemical injuries that led to repeated hospital treatment, including amputations, and he lost his life several months later, a few days after being removed from life support. For 5 long months, he had fought to recover from injuries that never healed, and his decline played out slowly rather than in a single moment. By the time he passed, the case had shifted from one of harm to one of loss of life. What could drive a daughter to do that to her own father? The reason is what makes the case so unsettling. The flashpoint, according to the case, was that Conrad had been drinking and was unable to drive Megan to a hair appointment ahead of her birthday party. A missed appointment. A celebration that did not go to plan. From that small, ordinary frustration came an act that would take 5 months to claim his life. What was the home like behind closed doors? The picture investigators in the court were given was of a household under strain. Conrad had struggled with drinking, and the family home was described in unsettling terms by Megan's own mother. It was not a portrait of stability. How did the case come together? Much of it rested on the accounts of those closest to the events. Megan's brother testified that their father had said Megan was the one who had harmed him, while Megan herself claimed she had only thrown bread and possibly water. The gap between those two stories was vast, and the jury had to decide which one the evidence supported. The turning point came in the summer of 2023. An Oakland County jury convicted Megan of a felony tied to the use of a harmful substance causing death, along with a misdemeanor domestic offense. The felony carried a possible penalty of up to life. So what would the punishment be? Here, the case took a turn that stunned many who followed it. The judge sentenced Megan to 1 year in jail and 5 years of probation, far below what the guidelines suggested and well under the term prosecutors had sought. Prosecutors had pushed for a sentence of several years, pointing to how Conrad had suffered before his death. Instead, because she had already spent well over a year in custody awaiting trial, she walked free almost immediately. The prosecutor objected on the record, calling the outcome far too lenient, but the sentence stood. Could such a light outcome survive review? It could, and it did. In late 2025, the Michigan Court of Appeals upheld the sentence in a unanimous ruling, writing that the trial court provided ample justification for the sentence imposed. The decision closed the door on the prosecution's hope for a longer term. So where is Megan Imirowicz now? She remains free, on probation expected to run until 2028. She has spoken publicly about her release, describing it as the answer to her hopes, and said a fellow inmate, herself a figure in a widely covered case, had helped her prepare her statement to the court. What stays with people about this case is the distance between the cause and the cost. A father gone after months of suffering, set in motion by a frustration most families would forget by the next morning, and a daughter who served roughly a year before walking back into the world. Few cases in recent memory have left such a sharp gap between the weight of the loss and the length of the sentence. This case played out in a quiet Michigan town in recent years. The last reaches back to 1990s New York and a night in Central Park that the city never forgot. Daphne Abdella. In the late spring of 1997, in the heart of New York City, a man lost his life on a night that would become one of the most infamous in the history of Central Park. At the center of it stood a privileged teenager who had everything money could provide and almost no limits placed on her behavior. The man was Michael McMorrow, 44 years old, a real estate agent. The teenager was Daphne Abdella, who, along with her boyfriend Christopher Vasquez, was responsible for his death near the lake in Central Park after the group had been drinking together. Abdella had come to know McMorrow through a support meeting they both attended. His body was placed in the water of the lake. How were two teenagers connected to a tragedy in one of the most famous parks in the world? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Police arrived at Abdella's family apartment overlooking Central Park on a routine check and found the pair washing themselves. What looked like an ordinary visit became the moment the case broke open. The two teens were tied to the scene almost at once, and the city woke to a story that seemed impossible to comprehend. Who was Daphne Abdella? On the surface, she had every advantage. She was the adopted daughter of a corporate executive and a former model, raised in a prestigious building, yet she had a reputation for trouble that had reportedly gotten her removed from more than one school, along with a history of heavy drinking that began young. Vasquez, by contrast, was described as a quiet, withdrawn young man from a very different corner of the city. How did two people from such separate worlds end up bound together by the same terrible night? The turning point in court divided the case in two. Both were tried as juvenile offenders in adult court. And in 1998, Abdella pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and received a term of roughly 3 1/3 to 10 years. Vasquez went to trial, and because the jury could not determine which of the two had inflicted the fatal harm, he was convicted of the same lesser count, with a similar sentence. Did Abdella use her time to turn a corner? Her path through the system suggested otherwise. She was first released on parole in 2004 after several years, having earlier been denied when the board cited her behavior and what it called a total disregard for human life. Freedom did not last. That same year, she was arrested for threatening a former inmate by phone, and her conditions were tightened. She later confronted a resident at a halfway house, was returned to custody, and served out the remainder of her maximum term. What had looked like a path back to ordinary life kept collapsing. each fresh chance undone by her own conduct, until the system simply held her until her time ran out. So where did all of it leave her? In the years since, her life has settled into something far quieter. She later filed a personal injury claim after a car accident, and in 2024, she was photographed near her home in the Bronx, now in her 40s and walking with a cane. Living an ordinary life with dogs and a car of her own. She has not been arrested again. Vasquez, for his part, reportedly lives in the wider Bronx area and has struggled with his health. What stays with people about this case is the collision of worlds it represents. A man who lost his life by the water in the most famous park in America. A privileged teenager with seemingly limitless freedom, and a quiet young man drawn into the same night. Renewed attention in recent years, tied to a streaming documentary, briefly pulled both names back into the spotlight before they faded again. Decades on, the two who were once at the center of one of New York's most shocking cases live separate, subdued lives, far from the headlines that once carried their names across the city. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.